Welcome to the Generations at Work podcast. Today we're going to speak about the different generations. Who are they and what do they do? Why is there so much conflict among the generations? And how can the generations work better together to have a more productive work environment? Welcome. I'm your host, Susan Davis, executive coach and facilitator with Maxwell Leadership, and I'm joined today by our generational expert, Dr. Tim Elmore. Welcome, Dr. Elmore.
Thank you, Susan. Good to be with you.
So excited to be here and be a part of this podcast. So much to discuss today.
Yeah.
Let me introduce Dr. Elmore for those of you that may be new to the generational discussion. Dr. Elmore is the founder of Growing Leaders, an organization that equips emerging leaders for the next generation. An author of over 40 books, spoken to over 500,000 leaders of big companies like Coca-Cola, Chick-fil-A, Home Depot, the NFL. So the list goes on and on. Dr. Elmore, we're so excited to have you here today.
This is going to be a fun conversation.
Yes. So let's talk about, we want to get these older generations to connect with the younger generations and grow with each other. That's really our focus today. But let's just start. Tell me, first of all, what got you interested in studying generational diversity? Like, what brought you to this point?
Yeah, good question. I think I became intrigued with this topic way back in the 1980s. So I went on staff with John Maxwell in 1983. By 1988, the baby buster generation had been officially introduced by social scientists. Now that was Gen X, but the first title they were given was baby buster. And I was a boomer, still am, still with you. But the busters were arriving at work a little differently. They were a little more jaded, a little more skeptical, a little more cynical, a little bit like Gen Z today. And so in 88, I began to study them. By 1990, the term Generation X was officially made public. A survey was done, and the buster generation said, we don't want to be called anything. Call us the X generation. So that's what stuck.
I love that.
Anyway, by the 1990s, I was just a student of this, not a master, but a student. By 2001, I did a book called Nurturing the Leader Within Your Child, and that was the very first book. I included a generation chart where I began to compare and contrast the builders, the boomers, the Xers, the millennials. Now the millennials were the new kids on the block. And then subsequently, I've just done a number of books. I don't claim to be the only voice on the topic, but I just feel like we've got to unpack why we're colliding in the workplace or even in the family, not collaborating like we could be and should be. It's just taking more work today.
We talked about this a little bit earlier before we get into the generations. Has it always been like this? I feel like maybe it's just exacerbated right now, but, did the boomers or the builders feel this way about the Xers? And how has this come to this way?
Well, I'm encouraged by the fact that thousands of years ago, this was a thing. Socrates, Plato, both philosophers that said kids in my generation are not respectful to their parents and they're not going to make it and they're lazy. And I thought that could have been written last week. So it's always been a thing. But I think the gap between generations got wider as the screens in our life went from public to private. Here's my hypotheses. When I was growing up, I was a little kid back in the 1960s and 70s. We had one screen in our house, and you know what it was?
Yeah.
A television.
Big, a piece of furniture.
That's
television.
Right. Yes, it was a big box. Back in the very beginning, it was a black and white TV. Yeah. That's in the history books.
We had to get up and change the channel.
Yeah, that's right. Actually get up off the sofa. So it was one screen. We all gathered around that screen and watched I Love Lucy or the Dick Van Dyke Show or the Andy Griffith Show, the Partridge Family. But we sat together, we watched together, we talked together, we laughed together. We were together. Fast forward to today, 50, 60 years later, we all have our own screen in our hands. And so a 17-year-old son or daughter can be on platforms and mom and dad have no idea. Yeah. They may know their daughter has an Instagram account. They have no idea she has 6 Finsta accounts, fake Instagram. So we're in different worlds, and those worlds just seem so separate. And it gives us language and echo chambers that aren't together. So when we show up at work and there's 4 or 5 generations, you can imagine gathering around the water cooler, we're having totally different conversations at 60 years old than the 22-year-olds that just graduated out of college.
This is, I see it as an executive coach and facilitator. I see it more and more. I
Yeah.
hear it more and more. I hear the conflict.
Yeah.
It seems to be one of the biggest problems that I
Yeah.
see in the corporate world. Let's talk about the different 5 generations that
Yeah.
are in the workforce.
Okay.
How were they formed? How were they
Yeah.
named? I love this. I think it's so
Okay.
interesting. So let's start with the builders.
Okay. Before I jump into the builders, as you were talking, I just thought of an illustration. I just talked to a manager last week over a big department at a major company. And he said to me, I don't know how to figure out these 22-year-olds. He said he sent out a message to his department and said, we need to have a meeting on Monday. His Gen Z employee, 22 years old, sent a link and he said, here's a calendar link on when I'm available to meet on Monday.
That is crazy.
Yeah. Well, this young person didn't want to be a knucklehead. They weren't trying to be.
They just didn't know.
They had no idea. They've never had any professional experience. And I don't know that I had much, but I had 6 or 7 jobs by the time I graduated college. So I at least gotten used to the professional environment. So it's just a different world today, and we've got to have empathy. That's probably the number one thing I'm going to be preaching is we've got to understand, then we can begin to build bridges. So
I think what you just said is so important, the empathy. I'm a Gen Xer.
yeah,
I was having just a friend group conversation recently.
Yeah.
And one of the other Xers was like, well, this generation,
Yeah.
this new generation, they just don't know. They just
Yeah.
they don't show up.
Yeah.
And I said, listen, we have to grow to them
Yeah.
and understand and build that bridge, not the wall.
Yep.
And
Yep.
and they're, I'm not doing that.
Yeah.
The word empathy is important there.
It is. In fact, you and I were just talking before the
Yeah.
recording. John Maxwell, decades ago, said something that stuck with me. He said, if you take a locomotive train engine, it's the job of the engineer and the locomotive engine to connect to the cars and pull them forward, not vice versa. So yes, we want our Gen Z employees to lean into us, but it's our job as leaders to make that connection and pull them forward, not push them, pull them forward. So I'm hoping in our podcast over the episodes this year, we can really help people do that. Okay.
Leaders go first. Leaders go first.
That's right. Leaders go first.
All right.
So the oldest generation that might still be in the workplace, and they're certainly in Washington, D.C. right now,
Yes.
are the builder generation. They would be born between 1929 and 1945.
Yeah.
So this generation was called builders because they built so much out of so little. They grew up during the Great Depression, which was a decade of economic depression.
Yeah.
And then World War II. So my dad's a great example. He passed away in 2020 at 90 years old. So the first decade of his life was the Great Depression. The next 5 years, World War II. He became frugal, grateful, conservative, turn the lights off when you leave the room, and save the wrapping paper at Christmas.
My grandmother,
Yes.
save the wrapping
Yep.
paper, the tissue paper, everything.
Yeah, that was my
aluminum
mom.
foil.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Everything.
Save it all. Rubber bands,
Yes.
plastic bags in the
Yes.
attic.
But they had to be frugal.
That's exactly right. And they carried that. My dad carried that waste not, want not attitude clear into the 21st century. So they were shaped by that. Okay. Next came along the baby boomers. And I'm one. We're senior citizens now. So the baby boomers were born between 1946 and 1964. Now, we're called boomers because 1946 was the year after World War II. So when the soldiers came home, families started growing. Okay, this is the biology lesson
Yes.
here. So 76.4 million people were born in 18 years between 46 and 64. I'm one of them. Well, because the population was so large, we were called the boomers. It was a boom of babies. And of course the boomers went through the pipeline of business and school and everything else, large and in charge. Yeah. In fact, we felt a little entitled way back in the 60s in our protests and burning bras and buildings and everything else along the way. It was crazy.
Which is kind of circled back.
It
So,
has.
Yeah.
Mark Twain was right. History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. So there's a rhyme going on that we can learn from if we just study what's going on. So that's the boomers. The baby busters came next. That would
That's
be your
me.
generation,
That's me,
a Gen
yeah.
Xer, although you look much younger
thank you,
than
thank
yes. So the Xers were born between 1965 and 1980, 82. right around the beginning of the 80s. And by the way, the reason we make these markers, we can talk about this later, is there's usually milestone events or experiences that start and end generations. So the boomers started right after World War II. They ended 1964 at the public introduction of the birth control pill. So instead of a boom, it was a bust. So the baby busters were this smaller generation that grew up in the shadows of the baby boomers, which kind of affected the psyche. So your generation, by and large, maybe not you, but your generation grew up a little bit more jaded about life, a little more cynical. If you think about it, what shaped the Xers as children was they looked around, and parents were, and coaches and teachers for that matter, were a little bit cynical about the Vietnam War, and then the Watergate scandal, and then the OPEC gas crises, and then we couldn't rescue some hostages from Iran. What's going on? This is not the America we had before.
And as an Xer, I didn't know that America,
Right.
but I saw my parents go
Yes,
through
you
it.
saw the adults raising you.
Yes.
So you actually grew up, maybe not even knowing why, a little more skeptical.
Yeah.
I'm not trusting authority. Well, doesn't that sound familiar today? So Z very much rhymes with X. And boomers very much rhyme with millennials. Not everything, but much. This just helps us to understand.
And then the greatest music came out in that
Oh,
generation.
of course it did. That's exactly right. Now, see, we would agree on that.
Yes, we would agree on that.
Okay, so I'm sorry I'm taking too long.
No, that's okay.
After the Gen Xers or the busters come the millennials. So busters were called busters because there was a bust of babies. Millennials are called millennials. They were the kids growing up in the 80s and 90s. They're called millennials because they'll spend their entire adult life in the new millennium, the 21st century.
21st century.
So they had a little bit of their life in the 1900s, but most of their life will be the 21st century. So my two kids are both millennials. They're in their 30s now. They're in the workplace now. And by the way, the millennials are now the largest generation in the workforce. So we can get mad or we can get busy, but they are now taking over the workforce.
And I feel like there's two parts, two divisions in the millennials.
Yeah,
There's
there
two
are.
different sets.
So
that a little
those
bit.
are called microgenerations. So I did a book in 2010 called Generation IY, Our Last Chance to Save the Future. And the reason I said that is because I felt like the second half of the millennials, the 1990s kids, were different than the 1980s kids. I have both. Bethany is born in the 1980s, Jonathan born in the 90s. They're different.
Yeah.
And yes, their personalities are different. We'll talk about that later. Certainly other factors go into making us different. But the time they were born and the wet cement that hardened was shaped by different tragedies, technology, heroes and villains. That's what shaped us in our early years.
Even within that one generation,
Yes.
formed a micro.
Yeah.
And I even see that micro generation even against each other sometimes.
Yeah.
They're making fun of each other.
Oh,
at
they
times.
are. It's quite funny. Change happens so rapidly today that Gen Z will make fun of older Gen Z. You guys are so antiquated, you know, and you're going, what are you talking about? You're 4 years. I talked to a senior in college that said to me, what's up with a freshman? And I go, you're 3 years different.
It moves so much faster.
Yeah,
I think the
it does.
technology is a big part of that.
That's exactly right.
Because one part of the millennials, they started with a cell phone.
Yeah.
The second part, basically a dictionary, a encyclopedia,
it's a smartphone.
a
Yeah.
smartphone.
It's
and
so true.
Completely different technology.
Game changer.
Game
Yeah.
changer.
So following the
All right.
millennials or Gen Y comes Gen Z. They're called a number of different names, but Generation Z would be the youngest workers in the workforce today.
Okay.
They're graduating college. They would be teenagers and young adults. They are the most misunderstood generation because of that echo chamber we've lived in, and they're in a different echo chamber. So different voices, different music, different technology, different values. So Susan, you've heard me say this, but I want to say it now as an analogy for our listeners. If you and I hopped on a jet plane and we flew to Asia, anywhere in Asia, as we hopped off that plane, we would naturally expect to psych ourselves up to connect with people there because, oh my gosh, they're different. They speak a different language in Vietnam. They have different values here. They have different customs here. That's what I'm saying. You have a Gen Zer, it's like a cross-cultural interaction, but we don't work at it. We don't want to work like we do in Vietnam, like we want to work here with the Gen Zers or the millennials. We just get mad instead of getting busy. We get frustrated instead of fascinated. And that's, I think, our problem as leaders.
That is such an interesting point, because as you verbalize that, it cements for me even more that, it's like speaking one language.
Yeah,
You
right.
miss out on, if there's 4 languages and you miss out on 75% of the conversation.
Yes.
Why are we so, just stuck in our heels that
Yeah.
this is my generation,
Yeah.
this is the way it should be, versus, hey, let me learn from other people.
Yes.
So why is this so important for leaders now?
Well, we suffer from something that social scientists call, we are chronocentric. Now, that's taken from 2 words. Chrono, taken from word the chronology. We feel like our life station and where we are, we have the best perspective on life. We vote the best, we think the best.
Yeah.
And centric is centers. So whatever age we are, we tend to think we understand. My kids, I love them to pieces. 30-somethings. They think we got visibility on stuff you don't. Now, of course they do, but I have visibility on stuff they don't.
Yeah.
So you're exactly right. What if we could learn from each other? So the analogy you and I talked about just before we started this recording was this. If you and I were to start a company that was going to be a global enterprise, and we're going to try to reach consumers all over the world, 8 billion people to reach, wouldn't we naturally welcome a representative from China, a representative from Latin America, a representative from North America? Of course we would. That's what I'm saying. I want Gen Z to weigh on how do we sell this new product, or millennials, or Xers, or boomers. In fact, when I wrote this book, New Kind of Diversity, I sat down with people from each of the four major generations and said, how would you market this to your people? How would you market this to yours and yours and yours? I got different ideas. And I'm going to market differently to a boomer than I do a recent college graduate. So
I want you to talk about the story of Burberry. And I think this
Yes,
really, it illustrates the need for the different generations to weigh in. And as leaders, we need that for our organizations.
we do. Burberry is such a great illustration. So Angela Ahrendts in 2006, I believe, was asked to be the CEO of this marvelous London-based fashion company.
Yeah.
Well, Angela was brought in because they knew we need new blood, we need new thinking here. And Angela wasn't young. She was old enough to be a CEO. But when she got there, after shaking hands with her fellow executives, the first set of meetings she called was with her youngest team members, the 20-somethings, the interns. She gathered them around, got a whiteboard, and she said, we're reaching old people here. And they're dying. Our customers are dying. And really, Burberry coats, if people don't know, was a high-end plaid trench coat, mostly.
Red,
sold for
tan,
$2,000.
black,
That's right. Yeah. Sold for a couple $1,000s sometimes. And of course, a 21-year-old didn't have the money to buy that. And the older folks that did were now no longer buying. So Angela said, you tell me, teach me. I want to be a learner and a teacher.
Good.
I hope our listeners are hearing that. I want to be a learner and a teacher. So they started giving her ideas. Here's how we could reach them. One of their ideas is my favorite. They said, we need to change up our website. Of course. They said, we need to have a page or 2 or 3 where we allow consumers to post pictures of themselves. We certainly like to do that. Wearing our coats, and they'll be on our site. Well, that took off. I mean, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. They started drawing a new demographic. The company, I believe, during the years that she was there, Angela was there, crippled. And she turned it over to young executives who were millennials and said, you take it from here. And she went to Apple, of course, and she was legendary at Apple. But the point was, she turned conventional wisdom on its ear. Instead of meeting with her 55 to 65-year-old veterans and coming up with a game plan and telling the interns to implement it, she did it just the opposite. She said, you guys, tell us what you think we should do to reach your demographic. We have the network. We have the budget. We'll implement. Isn't that crazy?
I think this is so important. And if the listeners are not hearing this, they need to hear it again, is that we need to embrace the different generations. You coined a term, which I love teaching when I coach, is reverse mentoring. And how these different generations can work together. Tell a little bit about that, because I think this is so important if we're going to be successful as leaders.
Reverse mentoring has been a game-changing practice for me as an old man. I will admit I'm an old man. But we have Gen Zers and Millennials on our team. In fact, most of our team members are under 40. So I'll meet with Andrew, who is 30 years younger than me. I'll meet with Cam, who's 40 years younger than me. And we'll sit down, and they're naturally willing to hear from me as an author and the founder, but we'll both wear the mentor hat. So first thing we do is exchange stories. You always find something in common when you exchange stories. And so we find common ground. But then I'll take a minute and pour into Andrew or Cam what they need to know about how this workplace works. Yeah. But then we trade hats, so to speak. And they'll start coaching me or mentoring me on how maybe the latest app could be used to monetize and maybe help us in marketing.
Yeah.
So the point is, in today's world, it can no longer just be the old mentoring the young. That's still needed. But it needs to be us putting on the mentee hat and saying, I need to learn. There's stuff I don't know, and you get smart technology better than I do.
Yeah.
So I really feel like that's going to be a secret in our day.
And I've heard the statistic this year, 2025, 75% of the workforce, Gen Y, Gen Z.
Yeah. They're the future. We're the past.
I'm seeing it. The organizations that I work with, that I coach with, I was seeing that number in 2024.
Yeah.
Just not a lot of builders as much. The builders were gone unless they were on a board.
Yeah, that's
right.
They
were advisory board.
Yeah.
The boomers were aging out. The Xers were the managers, the directors.
Yeah, that's right.
But they're looking for their way out. And here comes Gen Y and Gen Z.
Yeah.
So if we're not learning from each other, what happens?
Well, that's the rhetorical question of all time. The problem that I see that maybe we'll get into in another conversation is now millennials are starting to come into management positions. They're managing people older than them, and it's very awkward. I remember when I first, at 28, was managing people that could have been my parents, and I felt very awkward. But there are ways, if we build soft skills, not just hard skills, to make this happen.
Power skills.
Yeah, exactly. I know.
Power
I love
skills.
that. That's really what it is. But it's humility. It's respect. Those are fundamentals that Grandma and Grandpa taught us back in the day. We need to recover them instead of getting angry. So I'm telling myself as I look in the mirror every morning, don't get furious, get curious.
Get curious. I love that. I love that. We could talk about this all day. We'll do this in some other podcasts. I want to ask another question about ageism. Let's talk about ageism and how that affects the different generations.
Yeah. So ageism is always happening, like I said, way back to Socrates. But ageism is something that usually hits us later when we reach an age and we just don't change as quickly.
Yeah.
I will admit, I know I need to change. It's harder today. So our brains develop a little bit like wet cement. So when cement is first poured on a sidewalk, man, that first hour, you can put your handprint in that wet cement and make a print and sign your name or whatever you want to do.
Yeah.
You try it a year later, that cement is hardened. And you can change it, but it takes a jackhammer to change it. Yeah. Well, I always smile when I say this, but some people listening right now, you might need a jackhammer to change your mind about what you think about kids today or whatever.
And we all do it a little bit.
It's so true. You and I are both parents, and we're going, what in the world are you thinking? So I think that ageism is one of our biggest problems if we're not aware of it, that we can go through and just get stuck in our age and our frame of mind, and we think we're right, and we don't listen very well. The number one skill set I'm proposing to myself this year is I want to listen actively this year.
That's so good.
Yeah. And so in meetings, I'm trying to speak as if I'm right, but listen as if I'm wrong.
I've heard you say that before, and I've coached with that, and it's crazy. People are like, oh, that's profound.
Yeah.
Speak like I am.
Like I'm confident enough to be right.
But listen like I know nothing.
Oh, you won't believe what that's done as I spend time with my daughter, who's 36. When she hears her dad really listening.
It's a different conversation.
As if she was right. And I'm twice her age, or not twice her age, but almost. I'm telling you, it's a game changer.
You mentioned curiosity. As a coach, I'm big on curiosity. And another book that you've suggested that I read, I have a 11 and 13-year-old.
Yeah.
And I've changed the way I have those conversations because it wasn't working.
Yeah.
And so getting curious, asking the questions, listening to them and showing them respect and validation versus I told you so, this is the way it should be, has changed the dynamic of the relationship. Yeah. So what if we could do that in the workplace too?
I think that's the key. I really, really do. So it's playing chess, not checkers, allowing them to be the piece they are, not managing all people alike. I don't know who first said it, but we've all heard the phrase one size fits all.
Yeah.
No, one size fits one. Your kids, one size fits one. They're
Yeah.
different, right? And so our employees, if we're managing a department, one size fits one. So if we play chess, not checkers, we're gonna win because we're gonna know who we're leading.
And just as you were speaking about your daughter, I felt the emotion from you.
Yeah.
And what I'm guesstimating here is your level of influence increases so much.
Yes.
Because you listened to her, you
Yeah.
valued her,
Yeah.
which in turn raised your level of influence and over
It's so
her
true.
and with her.
It's so counterintuitive that not my imparting wisdom to her, but my listening to her increases my influence.
Yes. Isn't that
Who would have
crazy?
thunk it? Yeah.
So we'll kind of try to round this out because I know we
Yeah.
can go on and on. Let's
Yeah.
talk about why does each generation get stuck in their mindset? And we've talked a little bit about this,
Yeah.
but why do they get stuck in that mindset?
Yeah, I probably shared a bit that I can expand on. So our neural pathways in our brain, I'm not a neuroscientist, but I've
Yeah.
researched a bit. There's been some great stuff written on this. The neural pathways in our brain form, meaning the plasticity is very high when we're young. It becomes more rigid later. So the first 20 to 25 years are when we're most moldable. It's why children can learn languages so rapidly and 60-year-olds don't learn it quite as rapidly or learn to dance or learn to do anything. Everything's a little bit slower. So it can be overcome, but I think this problem hits us and we're not even aware that we're not right always as we go forward. We're stuck as we go forward and we need to learn more as we get older. I think we don't realize that, I said it briefly before, but I'll say it again. Most of my life has been in the past. Now, I'm backward thinking. I know I hate to admit it,
I
but
don't
it's
like
true.
saying that either.
Most of my kids' lives or most of the employees at our office, it's forward thinking. So my wife and I just had this conversation. We spent Christmas together with our adult children and their spouses. It was a wonderful time. But she was saying, oh, I wish we could see them again next month and then the next month. And I said, honey, remember, they are forward looking. We're backward looking.
Oh, that's so good.
And what I mean by that is they love us. They love us as mom and dad. They love the money we give them as mom and dad.
Nice Christmas present.
That's right, exactly, which are nicer than theirs back to us.
Yes.
But what I wanted to remind her is their whole life is ahead of them. And so while they do think about mom and dad, they're looking forward. Our employees that are 25 or 30, they're looking forward to when they'll take over. So how do I coach them and realize my leadership is a stewardship? I won't have it forever. I got it from someone else, and I'm going to give it away to someone else. And if I realize I'm not owning it, I'm stewarding it. I founded the organization, but I'm stewarding it, and I'm passing it off now. So I feel like that's a better mindset to have. I'm a steward, and I'm going to give it away. And my kids, I want to leave a legacy. But they're going to run faster and stand on my shoulders and hopefully do better if I look at it that way. And that's my key, I think.
There's no doubt in my mind, though, that your kids and your organization will look backward in those traditions, those values that you've instilled because you've listened. They're going to take that with them as they move forward. There's zero doubt.
I hope so. So the big two words, and maybe we need to close with this. My big two words that I have always on my mind is I must be timely and I must be timeless. So timely means I keep up with the times. Mm-hmm. I understand technology. I understand how there's a democratization of the workforce right now that I don't understand. But timeless is not antiquated. My grandparents taught me some timeless virtues like honesty and work ethic and belief in others. Those are timeless. Yeah. So we don't want one or the other. We want both. And that's where I think we need to model the way as leaders today.
Oh, so good, so good. So this is our first podcast. Let's just set this up for the viewers. Okay. Tell us, what are we going to talk about on this podcast moving forward? What are some things to get excited about, to get people excited about as they tune into the podcast?
Yeah, great question.
Yes.
So I'm really looking forward to how different generations look at work. Gen Z looks at work very different than Xers and Boomers. And it's one of our constant tensions that we have. So we'll look at how we view work. We'll look at how to motivate. I mean, the boomer might go on a bonus in a corner office. Gen Z's going, Would you help pay off my
Yeah.
college debt that I got right now? So we need to, just like you give a Christmas gift and it's different to Uncle Joe than it is to niece Stephanie. Think about the gift you're giving. Think about the motivation you're giving. So we're going to talk about how to motivate, how people look at jobs differently, how we give feedback. Gen Z comes across a little more fragile. So we got to give feedback a little differently, but we can do it. So we're going to jump into those conversations.
We're going to have some great conversations. As always, if you have questions, drop us a comment. Let us know what you are struggling with at work. Dr. Elmore can answer those questions. We can discuss so many topics. We've got a lot of things in store for you. We're going to have some fun too. Maybe some guest speakers. So we want you to come back and listen. I just think this is so important. And you have stated this mantra. We've got to build the bridges, not the walls, if we want to be effective in the workplace.
Absolutely. I totally agree. So that's where we're going with this podcast.
There we go.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here today, and we'll catch you on the next podcast.